Good morning. Welcome to Dr. D's Monday Morning Minute number 22. We're going to start out with a picture of the guy that started Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry. Gene was right about at least one thing. There are multiple realities. I don't know how many there are, but reality is in the eye of the beholder. I'm convinced it can be influenced by external factors, one of which I'll discuss today. This quote of his says, "The strength of a civilization is not measured by its ability to fight wars, but rather by its ability to prevent them." Our country is in a war right now. It's a civil war. It's a war about competing ideologies. I'm going to talk about one of the ones that's on the news every night. When I see a police car in my rearview mirror, I automatically check my speedometer, even though I almost always drive below the speed limit. Or if I'm walking down the street in DC, I would be pleased to see a police officer. But if I were black, I'd probably have a different reaction to seeing a cop. If you disagree, talk to a black person, then get back to me. White Americans see inner city violence on their TV sets and think, I'd never act like that, and wonder why so many black people do. Many assume they just want to steal stuff and get away with it. That's undoubtedly true with some, but 90% of the recent protests were peaceful, and even the ones that weren't. Most of the people there weren't vandalizing property or stealing stuff. We're suffering a breakdown in social norms. Respect for authority is crumbling. Our Constitution prioritizes liberty and says everyone is equal, but as I said last time, freedom produces inequality. I grew up in a home where mom and dad had steady jobs and provided a secure life for me and my sister. They were always home by 5. We went to church at least once a week. I attended a Christian day school where excellence was encouraged, and everybody expected a rewarding career after going to the college of their choice. I grew up in a town where the average household income was $125,000, and the largest educational category was those who had not only finished college but also had a graduate degree. I lived in a place where a house just sold. Well, let's see. Where a house just sold, a 942 square foot house just sold for $712 a square foot.
Are you serious?
It sold for $671,000. That's not much more than a tiny house you see on those TV shows. I never thought the crime I saw in the nightly news would ever affect my neighborhood, and guess what? It didn't. I grew up in a house where, in 1960, I helped my dad build this house. You know how I helped him? Each evening after work, we'd go over there, and I'd pick up rocks and fill the spaces in the cinder blocks with those rocks because he said it would make the house stronger. When they brought the sod, the men lifted off the sod off the truck and I rolled it out. I got filthy dirty that day.
What year did you guys build that house?
This was 1960. This house cost $24,000 to build in 1960. That's including the lot. And guess what it's worth now? That's what? How many years is that? That's 60 years later? That's 61 years later. This house is now worth $560,000. As an aside, housing is a pretty good investment, or it has been in the DC area. Is it fair for a kid from a broken family living in public housing and condemned to a low-quality education to compete for me with a job? I worked hard, but I was also privileged to see my work rewarded more than if my skin were black. And that's not fair. Many white Americans think since slavery ended 160 years ago, why can't black folks act more like them? If you've ever said that or even thought that, answer this question. If you were applying for a job, would you rather be yourself or an inner city black kid who had been educated in the local public school? In fact, try to think of an example where your answer would be different. Why? Slavery ended 160 years ago. A Harvard Black Studies professor who grew up in Piedmont has a TV show you may have seen,
Oh, yeah.
Tracing People's Roots, says that in the 350-year history of slavery in this country, the Atlantic slavery trade started in the early 1500s and ended in 1865. 12.5 million people were stolen from Africa. 1.8 million died on the trip over here. And total, eventually 450,000 of them made it to America. You say, where'd all the other ones go? Well, Brazil got most of them. Brazil got 40% of all the Africans. They got about 5 million Africans as slaves in Brazil. The majority of America's 42 million African Americans, black people, I'm going to use those words interchangeably, more or less, make up 12.7% of our population. Population being roughly 332 million. 12.7% are black. I haven't checked every statistic, but I wouldn't be surprised if black folks lead the way in every bad category. And I believe they're underrepresented in every good category. See if I'm right. Think of something bad and do a little research. I bet it's worse in the black community than it is in the white. I tried it with homelessness. Page 2. In 2019, there were an estimated, you want to guess how many homeless people there were in the United States? 568,000 homeless people in the United States. Multiply that by 12.7%, and that would be about 72,000 homeless black people if they were equally distributed. But the black percentage of homelessness is 40%. That means there's an extra 155,000 black people on the street than a random distribution. If you break it down further and to count only the homeless people who have children, black people make up 52% of the homeless population. You can do the same thing with any statistics. Crime, poverty rate. The black poverty rate is twice that of whites. Educational achievement, unemployment, home ownership, prevalence of disease. Consider encounters with law enforcement. I was taught, and my experience has been, that police officers are my friend, and they will help me if trouble is brewing. Many black children are taught, and their experience proves that cops are not their friends. In fact, that cops can't be trusted, even if the cop is black. A Pew Research study of nearly 8,000 police officers in 2016, that's before the current turmoil, showed that the views of police officers differed greatly from the general population. 67%, two-thirds of police officers, said the deaths of black people in encounters with the police were isolated incidents, compared with 31% who said they were part of a broader pattern. In numerous studies, the public had the opposite opinion, where 39% said the police killings in black Americans were isolated incidents, and 60% said they were part of a broader pattern. Basically the opposite. This is not an excuse for rioting, but it does explain why different races might react differently in the same situation. White Europeans didn't invent slavery 500 years ago, but in fact, Aristotle, the guy we so highly regard for his brilliance, taught that some people were born natural slaves due to their limited reasoning ability. The Portuguese started the transatlantic slave trade from Africa to the New World in 1525. 94 years later, That's 1619, which you've been hearing about in the news, the 1619 Project. Britain delivered the first 20 African slaves to America, Jamestown, Virginia. It cost 620,000 American lives in the bloodiest war to end slavery in 1865. With the passage of the 13th Amendment, things improved for blacks the next dozen years. That's the anti-slavery law. But in 1877, black lives didn't seem to matter much, as Southern Democrat politicians started writing Jim Crow laws that prevented blacks from using the courts to ensure equal rights. Southern states used intimidation to enforce segregation and suppress black voters. Their tactics, which included arrests, fines, jail, violence, and even lynching, continued until America buried Jim Crow for good in the mid-1960s with the passage of the Civil and Voting Rights laws. Even after these laws were made, forced segregation was illegal. The desire to keep the races apart led to de facto segregation in schooling and housing, where banks used redlining to prevent blacks from getting home improvement loans or mortgages for houses that were in white neighborhoods. I have purposely skipped the famous racial historical injustices you'll remember, like Rosa Parks and the year-long Montgomery, Alabama bus protest. Here's a bus that says colored people are seated starting in the rear. That's what it says right here on this picture. That's where Rosa Parks was sitting in a legitimate space, but a white guy, didn't have a seat, so they wanted her to stand so he could sit down. They protested for a whole year. Black people refused to ride the bus. And they finally won with the help of Martin Luther King. I've also skipped the assassination of famous civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King. I've also left out the recent tragedies of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd that led to our current racial strife. But as I write this, even ignoring those obvious examples of mistreatment based on skin color, I understand the reason many African Americans mistrust authority. They see cops as an incarnation of Southern plantation owners. They perceive they've traded away, slaving away in the cotton fields for substandard schools, low-paying jobs, and limited housing opportunities. Our inner cities seem less like America the Beautiful and more like an Indian caste system where opportunities for advancement are unavailable for inner city outcasts. I can understand why a black person hearing a white person proposing solutions for racial problems might agree with Shakespeare's Macbeth when he said, "It's a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing." Page 3. So hopefully, without sounding like an idiot, what ideas does this white man propose to help alleviate America's problems? Here's 10 ideas for a more fair America. Some may be controversial, but I think they would improve America, and at least they're a good way to start a conversation. Equal opportunity for all means a complete restructuring of every area of inequality. Number 1. It's undeniable that a child will be best if they are reared in a loving, intact, nuclear family. So anything that hinders that family structure must be eliminated. That includes many of the wishful thinking government programs that only pay if a family lacks a father. Also, the idea if you want a pay raise, just have another kid and don't marry the father has to go. The government must not be the father. Number 2. It's a fact if you want less of something, tax it. And if you want more of something, reward it. We encourage workers to have more children with a $2,000 tax credit. Since we want more intact families, we should eliminate the marriage penalty and replace it with a $2,000 marriage tax credit. 3. Most people have a higher self-esteem if they are able to provide for their own family than accept a check from the government. Therefore, number 4, competition improves products and reduces costs. So since we want well-trained adults, then the schools should compete for students. Public schools spend about $12,000 per student. So let the parents choose which school gets their $12,000. I bet the schools would improve. Number 5. All these well-trained students coming out of school will need family-sustaining jobs. The growth of a free market private sector will produce the jobs America needs if we can only prevent the arrogant politicians from mucking it up. 6. Being able to work is one thing, but choosing not to work will not be tolerated. Government checks for the lazy will not be provided. 7. A fair income tax rate should be implemented to pay for constitutionally mandated government responsibilities. Government spending should be prioritized like a family budget. Then an appropriate rate of taxation can be established. It should be almost impossible for the government to spend more than they take in, and a payment schedule must be implemented and followed to pay back all the previous borrowing. To protect the poorest workers, the first $25,000 income earned should be tax-free. That earnings amount is negotiable. Since savings and investments produce growth, they should also be rewarded and not taxed. 8. It's not fair that health insurance is free for some and drive others into bankruptcy. So a convenient major medical insurance policy should be provided to all employees. Better coverage policies should be available through private sector competing companies. 9. You can't work forever, so a sliding scale retirement system with incentives for working longer like we now have is good. But it's going broke. Social Security admits it's in a dozen years, projected retirement checks will be cut by 24% or taxes will be raised. 10. Finally, for the issue of vote suppression. It's not unreasonable to identify yourself if you expect your vote to count. In fact, it's a hallmark of how our system is supposed to work. Look it up. Each American citizen gets one vote. You don't like that? Vote to change it. You want people voting from prison? Or ballots handed out to each person sneaking across the southern border? Or high school kids voting? Or second, third, or even fifth votes counting? Just convince a majority of your peers. You get her done. It's a great system. Just don't ignore it. It's always the right time to do the right thing. We just need to agree on what the right things are. Now, I'm going to take a summer break from all these talks so I can weed my tomatoes. If you have a question you'd like me to think about, I'd be willing to start it up again sometime. Just let me know. If not, it's been fun. Have a good summer.